This is an unabridged fan read by Christian Karlström of A Good War by Robert Brooks. Part 3. The Battle of Ashenvale. The fighting grew fiercer when the night fell. Against Kaldorei, that was expected. Bathed in the moonlight of a loon, they stalked through the forest like predators, seeking any enemy who dared take another step toward their home. "My lord, they burned the bridges," rasped one of the Forsaken scouts. She had a fresh scar across her armor, but the remnants of her flesh seemed untouched. "We think they burned all of them," Saurfang grunted. The Falfaran River was not terribly deep or wide, but recent rains had left it swollen.
"Set up siege engines close to the river. Fire everything we can. Force the elves to stay under cover. And keep looking to see if they missed something. Any bridge will do. A big log. Something."
The scout saluted and ran off. She would relay the orders to every other scout she encountered. Saurfang took one last look at the map and made another mark on it. He had suspected that the Night Elves were going to make a stand at this river. It was a natural obstacle, but narrower upstream, easier to cross, and thus better defended. Saurfang decided to find out.
"We're moving north,"
he told his aides. They rolled up the command map and slid it into a tube that had been treated by one of the Horde's finest magi. It would resist fire, corruption, and most physical blows. The Blood Elf who carried the tube had orders to run, not fight, should violence erupt nearby. The real plan was in Saurfang's mind, but if the Night Elves managed to remove his head from his body, and they were going to try, the war chief would need that map to carry on the fight. It only took a few minutes to prepare Saurfang's command post to move. He did not need some complex hierarchy of officers to cater to his whims and make sure his feelings were coddled. He needed a small circle of clever tacticians who could quickly communicate his orders to roaming troops of soldiers. Add a decent contingent of skilled guards to deflect any assassination attempts, and it was a relatively small group. It had to be. This was the forest. The battle here would not be fought with armies marching in straight, organized lines. Saurfang hated that sort of business anyway. This was going to be 1,000 desperate skirmishes among the trees. Maneuverability was critical. Knowledge of terrain was critical. The Horde would have a disadvantage in both. This was Kaldorei territory, but the Night Elves were badly outnumbered and had been caught off guard. Once the first blow had been struck, Saurfang and Sylvanas carefully crafted deception shattered into pieces. The Horde could have only one reason to storm across Ashenvale, and that was to conquer Teldrassil and the city and its branches. Stormwind surely knew the attack was underway by now, and they would surely send reinforcements. But they also surely knew that they would not arrive in time, not without a miracle. The Night Elves knew that they were fighting to protect their homeland, and that it was almost impossible to save it. Yet, there was a lot of distance between here and Darnassus. It would not take many disasters to stop the Horde cold. A loud thunk echoed through the forest, followed by a distant, crackling explosion. Saurfang pointed toward the source of the second sound.
"That way."
The rest of his troops followed. In a few moments, they came across half a dozen siege engines, broken and burning among the Horde ranks. Horde soldiers were desperately trying to put out the fires as though the weapons could be saved.
"Leave them,"
Saurfang roared.
"They're destroyed. Care for the wounded and the dead and find out who did this."
The soldiers swept the forest to the rear and then searched the banks of the Falfaran River, but no culprits were found. "The Night Elves got away," Saurfang snarled. He kept moving. These soldiers had needed a kick, but their minds were back in the war. A short distance away, behind the main lines, was another group of siege weapons. One of the unit's officers, an orc with a sour expression and a false smile, sat near a pristine demolisher. He snapped off a fast salute as Saurfang approached.
My lord, it's good to see you.
Saurfang loomed above him disapprovingly.
Would you care to join the Horde in battle? Or is the weather too nice back here?
The officer's green skin flushed to a satisfying shade of purple. When you implied an orc was a coward, they took it personally.
You ordered us to deploy at a safe distance for protection. Who's going to protect these weapons from an ambush? You? Alone?
Saurfang jammed a finger into the officer's breastbone, pushing him backward.
You have an entire army a few steps ahead. Perhaps they could protect you.
Saurfang stopped, remembering something.
How far back are we from the front lines? Several hundred yards, my lord.
Saurfang growled at the officer.
And what is the maximum range of these weapons?
The officer wilted.
A couple hundred.
Saurfang turned to the siege crews.
We're moving forward, now!
They obeyed swiftly. When the siege engines arrived within the sight of the river, the High Overlord saw dozens of Horde troops taking shelter near some downed trees. Several boulders lay near them. A Tauren looked up, spotted Saurfang, and waved him off frantically.
Move back, my lord! We're taking fire! Is that so? From which direction? Saurfang asked. We don't know!
Saurfang gave the siege officer a glare that should have killed him. The officer certainly looked as if he wanted to die.
Then we will give you some cover fire. Line them up!
The siege engines moved into position without delay. The unit's officer might have been weak, but the crews were not. When they were ready, they looked to Saurfang. He gestured without a word, and 6 heavy boulders sailed over Falfaron River and landed with an impact that Saurfang could feel through his feet. He nodded approvingly.
Excellent. Again. Make them afraid to step out of cover.
While they reloaded, Saurfang rounded on the officer.
I wish you well in the battle ahead,
Saurfang said quietly.
I hope to hear of your many victories on the battlefield. Is that understood?
Yes, my lord.
Good.
With that, Saurfang moved on, leaving the ashen-faced orc behind. Saurfang's command group continued north. A pair of troll scouts met with him. The hottest fighting was just south of Savian, the old elven ruins that had now become a small lake. The Night Elves were holding strong across the river, they reported, preventing all crossings so far. Every time the Horde pushed, the Night Elves have let them come across the river, surrounded them, and then destroyed them. That was troubling. The Kaldari shouldn't have had the numbers to do that in more than one place at a time. Very well, Saurfang said, and he sent the scouts back into the field. Saurfang let their information simmer in his thoughts, only half listening while his subordinates discussed options.
Are the Night Elves stronger in numbers than we had anticipated?
If they have reinforcements, the entire strategy needs to change. Saurfang interrupted them.
We're going to Savian.
The Night Elves could not have the numbers they appeared to have. It was impossible. It was time to apply some pressure and prove it. Loras Sunbeam heard the hammer of a rifle clicking loudly. He slowly turned his head to the right. A couple of paces away, just a bit too far for a reliable dagger strike, the cold eye of a gun barrel was aimed between his eyes. Loras stayed still. His fingers crept toward the shurikens hidden in his sleeve. The goblin holding the rifle looked carefully at his face. Silvermoon, he whispered. Loras smiled. Durell Anadale. The gun lowered, and the goblin spat on the ground. You elves all look alike to me. That was probably all the apology Loras would get. He glanced at the forest around him. There were a couple of shadows he didn't trust a few trees away, so he gestured silently toward the goblin. Aim there. The goblin swung the rifle where Loras had indicated, covering the right side of a tree. Loras crept forward on the left side, daggers ready to strike. Nobody was hiding behind that tree. Loras turned to the next suspicious tree and crept forward. He sensed that the goblin was once again covering him. That tree was clear too. So was the next, and the one beyond that. Lorash finally relaxed and returned to the goblin. "Well, that was fun," the goblin said, shaking his powder. The blood elf extended his hand. "My name is Lorash. Yours?" The goblin reached up to shake. "Shickers!" Lorash raised a brow. Your name is what?" The goblin looked ready to spit again. "You don't always get to choose your own nickname, pal. Not where I grew up. Your friends give you your name." "They call you Shickers? And you let 'em?" The goblin's expression soured. "You want to keep talking about my name? Really?" Lorash decided he didn't. "My partner is lost. Are you alone too?" "Lost?" The goblin frowned. "As in, we got separated, or as in?" "He is dead. He took one of the Night Elves' commanders before he went, though." "Hooray for him," Shicker said. Then he grimaced. "Sorry, I'm not trying to be a jerk. I get stressed out behind enemy lines, you know." "I understand." The Falfarin River was several miles away, and the sound of the Horde's siege engines faintly rumbled through the air. This was Night Elf territory. For the moment. Lorash had some ideas that might change that. "Do you have a companion?" "I got the captain with me." "I see." Lorash didn't. "The Night Elves are maneuvering quickly. I think they have groups traveling from one hotspot to another. Any time the Horde tries to cross the river, they run to stop us. And I believe it has worked so far. Have you seen anything like that?" The goblin snorted softly. "Yeah, I saw it." He pointed up towards the branches. "Druids are running in packs up there. Go a little further down, they're close to the path." "They're running across the branches? Interesting." It explained why Lorash had such difficulty finding tracks on the ground, and running in packs. Dangerous. Effective if they could do so undetected, but dangerous. Step on a weak branch at the wrong time and the whole pack might fall. "That sounds like an opportunity, my friend," Lorash said. "How many of them?" "Lots," Shicker said. "Care to join me in changing that?" Shickers grinned and patted his ammunition pouch. The soft jingle of metal bullets was answer enough. Saurfang had a strong impression of what was happening. The Night Elves were sending their best fighters up and down the river, bolstering any place where the Horde pressed their attack. They let the advance force get a few steps past the river and then they ambushed them. Not a bad idea, but not a long-term strategy. Exhaustion alone would end the tactic by sunrise, if the Horde's infiltrators did not kill the roaming groups first. It would be hours until morning, and Saurfang had little desire to wait. The survivors of the failed attack across the river had all reported facing enemy druids. There were ways to solve that problem. He found himself enjoying the thought. "By the gods and the spirits in all the cosmos, it is good to fight a good war." Saurfang called for nearby spellwielders to report to him. Within a few minutes, a decent mix of 7 magi, warlocks, and shaman had answered the call. "Perfect."
"I want you to join the siege units for the next hour,"
he said. He explained his plan in simple terms. Their eyes widened. With shock? Excitement? As he spoke, a troll warlock's enthralled imp began to shatter with fear. The troll raised a hand as if he was going to cuff the demon, and the imp quieted down to soft grumbles.
"Is there a problem?"
Saurfang asked. "This little one be scared of starting a fire. Might get out of control," the troll said.
"That's why we're not using Fellfire. Understood, everyone? Shaman, it falls upon you to keep things contained. Do not make their jobs impossible. We set the forest ablaze and our attack is over."
That gave Saurfang pause. What if the Night Elves set fire to their own forest? With all of Ashenvale burning, the Horde's advance would stop dead, and plenty of his forces will not escape the flames. He hadn't thought of that.
"Because it's unthinkable," Saurfang decided. "No chance they'll burn down their own territory. Wait for the signal,
he said.
If an hour passes, return here for new orders.
They murmured agreement and ran off to obey. Saurfang told his aides to prepare to move again.
We need to find the war chief.
They found her 15 minutes later near the edge of the river, farther south. Sylvanas Windrunner and Nathanos Blightcaller had joined a group of archers who were sending a shower of arrows over an embankment and onto the gathered Night Elf forces behind it. Sylvanas noticed Saurfang's approach. "Keep firing," she told the others. Saurfang huddled together with her and Nathanos. The Forsaken Ranger said, "We're not making a lot of progress with your plan, High Overlord." The orc ignored him.
War chief, have you been behind their lines?
"Briefly. I know a trap when I see one. He is here, Saurfang, waiting for me," Sylvanas said. Malfurion Stormrage. The war chief showed no fear, but Saurfang couldn't help but feel a chill. It was one thing to face the possibility of an honorable death in war. In a duel against Malfurion, he had no doubts he would lose.
How would you like to handle him?
"If you can shatter their lines, he will come to stop you," Sylvanas said. "And I will follow him. Stand against him for a few minutes, and I will drive him away." It was a sound plan.
Lokdar Ogar,
he said, and began to move off. The best place for a breakthrough would be a narrower part of the river to the south. "We begin soon. For the Horde!" The archers around her whooped and roared, "For the Horde!" The druids were quiet, shockingly quiet, and were perhaps a dozen of them coming. No, more than that. But Loras could only hear the soft patter of paws and the creaking branches bending beneath their weight. Most had taken forms of large cats, powerful, quick night sabers who could leap from branch to branch effortlessly. A few took forms of birds, their huge wingspans spread wide as they glided just below the canopy of the forest. Loras was impressed. They were invisible from above because of the canopy, and obstructed from below by the branches and leaves. Quiet as they were, they had no way to hide from the moonlight filtering down through the trees. Not like I can, Loras thought. He was perched on a branch 70 feet off the ground, motionless, waiting. He had taken position in the tree trunk's shadow and employed a touch of the other shadow to make himself truly unseen. One hand held onto the tree, the other held a dagger. But when he saw the druids coming, he put it away. The time for close-up work would come, but he needed to get the night elves on the ground first. They were only seconds away. Doras let go of the tree and crouched on the branch, balancing on the balls of his feet. He reached into his sleeves 2 shurikens, poison-tipped. Their metal scuffed and dulled so it would not reflect the moonlight, fit snugly between his index and middle fingers. The saber's eyes gleamed in the dark. He could see each tusk jutting from their mouth, each feather on each bird. One of the sabers leapt past him. His head turned, looked straight at Loras, and the druid kept running. The blood elf could not keep his mouth from twisting into a grin. Half of the druids passed him in the same way before he struck. His wrist rotated, his hands opened, and the shurikens flew. 2 of the birds shrieked, flapping their wings erratically as the poison went to work. One slammed into a tree trunk with a sickening sound, and the other spiraled toward the ground. He had 6 shurikens left. 2 more whistled through the air. One hit, the other missed. The pack turned. They knew they were under attack, but they did not know from where. Loras showed them. He leapt from his branch, passing through a beam of moonlight. He landed on a branch in the next tree and leapt for the next. Snarls and growls echoed behind him. They gave chase. He kept running, using the druid's route, traveling at almost full sprint the way they had come. At the very least, he was leading them away from the battle lines. The branches shivered under his feet. The druids were calling upon the forest to stop him. In a few moments, the branches would shy away from his footsteps, vines would entwine around his ankles, and perhaps the trees themselves would open up, drawing him inside to suffocate within their bark. He had heard tales of such things. Lorash landed on a branch of a gnarled tree. The branch was capable of holding the weight of a single creature. He turned to face his pursuers, letting 2 more shurikens fly. Both were misses, but they made the night elves scatter. 2 left. A druid leapt for him. The cat's huge mouth was open, tusks primed to slash his throat. Lorash ducked, drew his daggers, and swiped in an upward arc. Blood showered onto his head and neck, and the druid offered a strangled, gurgling cry as she fell to the ground far below. The other druids roared with rage. Lorash stood up, smiled, and gestured to them with his bloody daggers. "Come on then, avenge your friend." 4 eagerly jumped to his branch. He stepped off calmly. He fell freely for a heartbeat before slamming the dagger into a tree trunk, dragging himself to stop about halfway down. Then he let himself fall the rest of the way. He had misjudged the distance a bit. His knees complained loudly upon his landing, but they held his weight, so he ignored them. Above him the druids had landed on the branch together. It had instantly snapped under the weight, and they all fell. Most hit the ground awkwardly, the impacts making the soil shiver under his feet, and the rest of the druids climbed or flew down to help. Lorash went to work. The stunned druids had little chance, not against blades wreathed in poison. Roots peeked up from the soil, but Lorash danced away from them easily. A terrible squawk filled his ears. Sharp talons and an angry, snapping beak descended upon him. Whoom! The sound half deafened him. The bird's head jerked as though struck. She fell upon Lorash, her dead weight pinning him to the ground. No, not dead. Not yet. The blood had felt the bird's heart thumping hard. A twist of a blade fixed that, but still, he was trapped underneath her corpse. Whoom! Shikar's rifle thundered again. Lorash had heard the goblin's whistle over the chaos. "Go get him, Captain!" Lorash shoved and raged, trying to free himself. Thoom! By the Sunwell, that goblin can shoot fast. He paused his struggles. He heard a new sound, something he had never heard before in battle. A large creature was crashing through the forest, its footsteps overlapping in a strange chorus. Chicker, 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 chicker. Then he heard screaming. When Lorash finally dragged himself underneath the bird, dripping with sweat and blood, the gunshots and screams had stopped. A single creature stood amid the bodies of the druids. "You must be the captain," Lorash said. The huge 4-legged creature clicked its claws, pincers, together and turned its eyes toward him. It stood nearly as tall as Lorash's waist. Chicker stomped his way out of the brush, grinning, his smoking rifle cautiously resting on his shoulders. The crawler's light blue shell was almost as big as the goblin and probably weighed twice as much. "She ain't bad, is she?" Lorash had no idea crawlers could do anything but taste delicious, but he kept that thought to himself. "No, she is not. I did not realize they could survive outside the ocean." "You learn something new every day, right?" Shakers admired their handiwork. "Unless my eyes deceive me, she took down more than you, bud." He was wrong, but not by much. Angry wounds in the shape of the captain's pincers were carved into at least half a dozen of the druids, but before he could form a reply, he felt a shiver in his feet. Lorash stood still, listening, and then he whispered, "Hide." Shickers turned and squinted into the night. The cocky expression slid off his face. "Yeah, hide." They hid behind one of the larger tree trunks and waited. The crawler followed them into the brush. The rumbling that Lorash had heard grew louder. Shickers slowly thumped back the hammer of his rifle, but the elf put his hand on the gun. "No," Lorash mouthed. Shickers nodded stiffly. The captain, bless her encrusted heart, stood still and made no noise. The rumbling grew louder. It nearly passed their tree and then it stopped. Lorash risked a glance. A large stag stood in the middle of the dead druids. Lorash stiffened. "Is that?" The stag shifted in a flash of mist. When it cleared, a tall night elf, powerfully built, metal claws strapped to his wrist and large antlers rising above his head, stood over the bodies of his fallen people. Loras leaned back behind a tree. His heart pounded, but not out of fear. No, it was not fear at all. For he had hoped for this ever since High Overlord Saurfang had revealed the true nature of the plan to him. Shickers was staring. "Who is it?" he mouthed. "Malfurion," Loras mouthed back. The goblin swallowed hard. His dry throat clicked. Malfurion spoke softly. "Rest easy, my brothers and sisters. Your sacrifice will not be in vain. I swear it." Lora's hands twitched towards his sleeve. 2 more shurikens. Did he dare? Killing Malfurion would all but guarantee victory for the Horde, but that was not at the front of his mind. Would his poison slow Malfurion down by even a heartbeat? If half the stories about him were true, it might not. A hand gripped Loras's wrist. The elf ignored it, thinking through his plan of attack. Step out, throw, retreat, move, get behind him. The hand gripped tighter. Finally, Loras looked at the goblin with a frown. Shickers was mouthing something, but Loras did not recognize the words at first. It was as though he were speaking a foreign language. Then he realized the goblin was silently cursing at him in a way that only a goblin could. But Loras caught the gist of it. "Step out there, and I'll kill you myself." Loras nodded, and the goblin finally relaxed. They waited until Malfurion finished paying his respects and ran off. Shickers heaved a huge sigh of relief. "You out of your mind, buddy?" "I want Stormrage's head," Loras said curtly. "Will you help me ambush him when he retreats?" The goblin scoffed loudly. "You're a real piece of work." He grimaced, shook his head, and checked out his ammunition. "The answer is no. Not without another, 20 to 25 soldiers to help us out. But I'll back you up until then." They walked into the forest. The crawler obediently followed them. Chicker, 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 chicker. A mage sent a massive fireball into the sky. It bathed the forest in a flickering orange glow that could be seen for miles. It was time.
"Horde, with me!"
Saurfang bellowed, charging across the river. This was only one attack of many. At least 24 other crossings would happen simultaneously. The Night Elves could not possibly stand against all of them. 2 magi, an orc and a troll, had the idea to freeze this area of the Falfarin River, allowing an attack party to simply walk across. It was so simple and so brilliant that Saurfang had instantly agreed to it. As Saurfang charged across, the war cries of about 50 others sounded behind him, along with the loud whistles of magic-touch siege payloads flying overhead. The payloads exploded on the ground, lighting up the forest. Saurfang scanned the shadows of the other embankment between the flashes, looking for hidden enemies. He saw none. Then he lost his footing on the ice and saw nothing but sky. Saurfang bellowed again, this time in outrage, as his back slammed into the frozen river. Many of the horde leapt past him. A few others slipped and fell around him. He scrambled to his feet with a snarl, stomping off the ice and up the embankment. He heard the fighting before he saw it. Blades against blades, shouts and screams. Another mage spell flashed across the forest, giving a blink of illumination. It was enough to see a druid in saber form leaping towards his throat. Saurfang swung his axe once. The enemy was dead before hitting the ground. A clean kill, his soul sang. He ran, charging straight into the fighting. An arrow clanged off the armor across his throat. Close one, and he rotated his axe, holding the blade low. He swept upward, and it would have split an elf in two had its target not jumped backward. But she did not retreat. She jumped at him so boldly that he did not have the time to react. Her heel slammed just above his armor into his bare temple. Saurfang staggered back, bright stars in his vision. Only sheer will kept him conscious. She came after him again, her fists a blur. She is unarmed. But the pain in his head suggested that that wasn't quite true, was it? A monk's hand and feet were weapons in their own right. As skilled as she was, she revealed her weaknesses. The way she deftly avoided the blade of his axe told him that she was focusing on it too much. Saurfang spun his axe in a double loop, and when she ducked, he leaned forward and planted a heavy boot into her stomach. She stumbled back and fell into the brush. She wasn't dead, but Saurfang turned to the rest of the battle. Getting absorbed in a single combat when dozens of enemies were within reach was a quick way to die. A pair of horde warriors sliced at roots and branches that had emerged from the ground. Saurfang joined them. He could not see the druid who was causing it, but that did not matter. When the plants were quelled, all three of them charged at the Night Elf's rear guard. The momentum turned quickly. If the Kaldari did really have an elite unit of reinforcements, they had chosen to fight at another crossing, or, less likely, they had been waylaid and destroyed. The Kaldari were too badly outnumbered to win, and their lines were breaking. Still, they weren't running away. "This is not the place to hold your ground, fools." Or was it? The Night Elves certainly did not fight like fools. A chill ran through Saurfang's belly. They were buying time. For a reason. There could only be one. He raised his voice above the din.
"Rally! Rally to me! Form up!"
It was too chaotic for everyone to hear him, of course. An orc with an axe in each hand ran past Saurfang, hauling a war cry. Saurfang jutted out his own axe shaft, whacked the orc around the ankles, and watched him fall face first into a pile of dirt.
"Rally!"
he roared again.
"Form up!"
His cry took flight. Horde warriors began to chant, "Form up! Form up!" Slowly, the horde soldiers disengaged from their individual battles. The tripped orc scrambled to his feet and stood beside Saurfang, breathing heavily, eyes twitching from humiliation. Saurfang pretended that he had not seen him fall.
"Go back across the river," Saurfang told him. "Round up the Magi, the Warlocks, and the Shaman. Anyone with command of magic, get them here now."
The orc rapped his fist against his chest and sprinted off without a word, brushing off the dirt of his armor. Saurfang directed the others into small groups.
"Archers in the back, shields up front, spellcasters go into the middle. Be ready for a counterattack."
Almost all of the horde's troops had obeyed his command. The Night Elves had stepped back as well because, yes, they were not fools. That confirmed Saurfang's suspicion. Where is he? Where is the trap? Saurfang searched the dark woods for a sign. There. In the distance stood a silhouette backlit by beams of moonlight. A single elf. Feathers on his arms and antlers on his head. Eyes glowing in the darkness. One by one, the other horde soldiers caught sight of him. Reinforcements arrived across the river. Saurfang issued orders without looking away.
"Magi to the left, Warlocks to the right, Shaman with me. Hold!"
They obeyed, finding their positions and holding fast. Still, the elf in the distance did not move. Not for 1 minute. 2 minutes. 3. Nothing moved. Saurfang was patient. Others were not. "Luxar Ukar!" Saurfang's head snapped to the right. The cry had come from a small squad of orc warriors some distance away, still wet from crossing the river to the north. They had spotted the elf and were charging in.
"To me! Rally to me!"
Saurfang bellowed. Too late. The elf's eyes shifted toward the orcs. The forest of Ashenvale came alive. The full-throated war cries of the orcs were cut off. There were no screams, no thrashing, no prolonged combat, simply a flurry of movement in the darkness, and then the sound of armored bodies hitting the ground. The elf hadn't lifted a finger. Such was his command of nature. His eyes locked once again onto Saurfang's, and his voice carried easily through the trees. "This is not your land, High Overlord," Malfurion Stormrage said.
it is now,
Saurfang replied calmly.
You and your people have a chance to leave in peace. Take it, Arc Druid.
Peace! Malfurion's words carried such anger. The Horde will pay in blood for each step it gains. The Horde ranks stirred, either from nervousness or excitement. Anyone who got a lucky shot on Malfurion would be a legend. Many of them were probably consumed by the thought.
Do nothing until I give the command,
Saurfang whispered, and then loudly,
Come then, Stormrage, make us leave.
Malfurion did not move. He just watched them. He had set a trap. Saurfang was sure of it. The Night Elves had held out for far too long, spent too many lives at this river to have lacked a reason. If the Horde had kept pushing, if they had succumbed to bloodlust and lost themselves in the joy of routing a beating enemy, they would have blindly rushed forward into a Malfurion. Only a few had taken the bait. The other Night Elves retreated. Malfurion now stood alone. The Kaldorei had to pull back. Once they had lost one portion of the river, they had lost all of it. The Horde would soon cross the river, surround Malfurion, and make his escape impossible. Strong as he was, the Night Elf would fall if he tried to make his stand here. And the Archdruid had to suspect that Sylvanas Windrunner was nearby, lurking in the dark, waiting to ambush him. So Saurfang would wait. He could not lose if he simply waited. Malfurion knew it too. After a few minutes, he finally stepped back, disappearing into the darkness without another word. Dozens of Hordes sighed in relief, and a few in disappointment. Saurfang waited a few minutes longer, just to make sure the danger had passed, and then he raised his voice again.
The Horde has taken Falfarin River,
he said. Roars of victory erupted all around him. Weapons and shields rattled together. One of the Blood Elf Magi launched a celebratory fireball into the sky. Saurfang made no move to stop them.
Let Malfurion be chased away by the shears of his enemies. Let the entire Kaldorei know that their defeat comes now.
Saurfang sent runners up and down the river to spread the news, and before long, the faint sound of celebration rose in the distance. The Horde had seized one of the few obstacles standing between them and victory. The battle had just begun, and the rest would not be easy. But this was going to work. The Horde would soon earn a magnificent, honorable conquest. And what a prize Darnassus would be. Lorish hung high in the air, his ankles interlocked around a tree branch. His mind was still, calm, and eager. Very eager. Oh yes, he had waited a long, long time for his chance. Chickers has tried to talk him out of it.
You're out of your mind, pal. You can't take on Malfurion Stormrage by yourself.
If we can surprise him,
I ain't taking the captain into that, get me?
The goblin had been resolute.
You do this, you do it alone.
And so, Lorish was alone. He had faintly heard Malfurion's booming voice and Saurfang's taunting replies. Many of the Night Elves had retreated this way, so he suspected Malfurion would too. The Night Elf leader would need to join them to plan the next phase of the defense. And maybe, just maybe, Malfurion would be distracted. He had suffered a loss. His mind might be occupied. The sound of a foot pressing down on soft leaves brought a smile to Lorish's face. The time had come. For my father. For my mother. For my people. His ankles moved. He fell headfirst toward the ground, a dagger gripped tightly in each hand. He had timed this perfectly. Malfurion was directly underneath him, not looking up. Laura swept both daggers in an arc, and when they crossed, they would meet Stormrage's neck, removing his head. They never crossed. Malfurion stepped aside. The instant before Lorish crashed into the ground, tree roots burst out of the earth and slapped his wrists. He dropped his daggers. He cried out in surprise as he landed on his right shoulder and neck. There was a sharp jolt of pain. His right arm went numb, but Lorish could still move. More roots took that away from him too. Before he could leap to his feet, roots wrapped tightly around his wrists, ankles and neck, pinning him to the ground, immobilizing him. Damn! Lorsius fought against the roots for only a moment, but it was useless. They could have already killed him, crushed the life out of him, or ripped his limbs off his body, but they hadn't. The Blood-Elf stared up hatefully at Malfurion, who looked back down on him with pity.
This is senseless. This invasion is senseless, Malfurion said softly. Brother, we should not be enemies.
Lorash's dagger lay several feet away from him. They might as well have been worlds away. He had 2 shurikens tucked in his sleeve, but that was it. He had no doubt that he would die if he tried to throw them, not unless he could distract Stormrage.
The rest of the Horde I can fathom. Sylvanas I can fathom, Malfurion continued. But our people once lived together. We fought together in the same wars. We died for one another. It was true long ago, and it was true only a few months ago, out on the Broken Isles. There should be no divide between my Calderai and your Cinderai.
Lorash hissed through the root that gripped his throat. And who created that divide, Stormrage? Who exiled my people?
I remember the faces of those who left that day. Yours was not among them, Malfurion said. Are you invading my homeland because you heard stories from before you were born? Or are you blindly following orders from your fallen war chief? I cannot decide which is worse.
Lorash still wasn't dead. That surprised him greatly. Malfurion wants to talk. A leader of the Night Elf people genuinely believed that the Blood Elf had no reason to take part in this battle. Lorash was happy to educate him. Yes, that happened before I was born, he said. I was born in Trisval Glades. As a child, I had to flee with my family and all the rest. I remember wandering for years. I remember a long winter trapped in the mountain peaks. I remember my father hunting despite the cold, losing one finger to the frost, then 2. I remember one day he never returned at all. How many of your people have frozen to death, Malfurion? Do we share that history too? Malfurion did not answer. Lorash smiled inwardly. He could not use his daggers, but he could still make Stormrage bleed. I remember centuries of warfare against the trolls, Lorash continued. I remember seeing pieces of my childhood friends decorating the huts and villages of the Amani. Trophies, you see. Was it the Calderai who came to our aid in those days? No. I remember the day death itself marched on our homeland, when my mother died and was raised into the Lich King's army. Who had to kill her and put her to rest? Was it you, Malfurion, who stood with us as we lost our homeland?
My people had just repelled the Burning Legion, and in doing so, lost our homeland, Malfurion said sharply. And despite the years of war between our 2 factions, we never attacked your home. We have never even dreamed of it. I have dreamed of little else, Lorash said. Then I am glad most of your kind is not as lost as you. And I am glad that you will live to see my kind conquering your home, Lorash said. How far can I push this? His heart told him he'd already gone too far. His soul told him to go even further. Does that thought fill you with disgust? The temples of Elune filled with Cinderai. Lorash saw a flash of movement, dark and swift out of the corner of his eye. Someone was coming. Malfurion looked up. He had noticed it too. You, said Malfurion. Ishuna Dal Dieb, said Sylvanas Windrunner, raising her bow. This was Lorash's chance, his only chance. His hand wrestled against the roots and his fingers desperately stretched toward the last 2 shurikens. It only took a heartbeat. In that heartbeat, a war raged above him. The Blood Elf watched in awe.
Shadow-wretched arrows and green-laced magic darted through the air. A burst of dark powers shoved Malfurion back, and Lorash felt the roots binding him go loose. Lorash drew both arms back, shurikens held so tightly that he felt the tips picking his palms. He didn't care if he poisoned himself. He was so close, so close. Malfurion looked at him, at the weapons in his hands, and the root around Lorash's throat squeezed. Lorash heard a grinning crunch. His eyes were still open. His mind was still racing, but his body wouldn't obey him. His lungs wouldn't draw breath. His entire body was numb. His thoughts were fading. "Your kind has not conquered my home yet," he heard Malfurion say. Was that to him or Sylvanas? Lorash did not know. A few moments passed, blackness pulsed in his vision. That was his own poison, probably. Sylvanas Windrother stood over him, saying something he couldn't hear. If Lorash was seeing her, Malfurion must have retreated. Damn! He still lives. Lorash had failed. He wondered if he would see his family on the other side. Shickers cautiously emerged into the clearing. The captain shuffled among the right behind him. Lorash lay motionless on the ground. A root was wrapped around his throat, and his head rested at an unnatural angle from his body.
"Ah, jeez,"
Shickers breathed. The war chief turned toward him, bow still pulsing with dark power, red eyes searching his soul. "Did you know him?"
"We were fighting together."
Shickers had to ask the obvious question.
"He didn't make it, did he?"
"No. He challenged Malfurion alone, and he died for it," Sylvanas said.
"Guess everyone's gotta go sometime,"
the goblin muttered. The war chief did something he didn't expect. She smiled.
"Very wise words," she said. "Report back to High Overlord Sourfang. This war is just beginning."